March 1945, the German town of Leichenfels. A thin morning mist clings to the stone walls of a central square. It is a quiet Tuesday. Usually, the only sound would be the bells of the local church, or the rhythmic clatter of a baker's cart. Not today. Today the air is thick with the smell of diesel and the metallic tang of fear. What could make hardened American soldiers stop in disbelief the moment they entered a town? What could force terrified families to stand between innocent children and the last desperate men of a collapsing regime? And why would one officer, responsible for a decision that shocked even his own side, later beg for mercy from the very army hunting him? As American forces pushed deeper into Germany during the final weeks of World War II, reports began emerging from a small town caught directly in the path of retreating German troops. Witnesses claimed that an SS officer, determined to save himself from capture, had made a choice that placed innocent civilians in unimaginable danger. Children, parents, and elderly residents suddenly found themselves trapped in a situation they never chose and could not escape. Yet the story did not end there. Because when the town finally fell and the officer was captured, everything changed. The man who had commanded others, without hesitation, was no longer giving orders. He was asking for something instead: compassion. And the decision about whether he deserved it would eventually reach one of the most feared and respected commanders in the American Army, General Patton. This was no longer just a battlefield story. It became a test of justice, leadership, and morality at a moment when emotions were running higher than ever. Innocent civilians had suffered. American soldiers had witnessed the consequences firsthand. The war was nearing its end, but the wounds it created were still fresh. The question was simple. Should a man who used innocent people to protect himself receive mercy when his own life was finally in someone else's hands? To understand why that question became so controversial, we have to start with the officer, the town, and the desperate final days of a collapsing Germany. The officer at the center of the controversy was not a famous general or a high-ranking political figure. He was an SS commander whose authority existed on a much smaller scale, but in the chaotic final months of the war, that authority gave him enormous control over the lives of ordinary people. By March 1945, Germany's military situation was rapidly deteriorating. American forces were advancing from the west, town after town falling as the Third Reich struggled to hold its collapsing front lines together. Many German officers accepted the reality that defeat was approaching. Others refused to face it. Some became increasingly desperate, convinced that survival justified almost any decision. The residents of Leichenfels were among the people trapped between these competing realities. Families who had spent years trying to endure the war now faced a new danger. The fighting was moving directly toward them. Parents worried less about politics and more about keeping their children alive long enough to see peace. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Karl, the son of a local carpenter. Like many children his age, he had grown up knowing little except war. His mother hoped that the arrival of Allied forces would finally end the fear that had defined his childhood. Instead, a new nightmare emerged. As American troops approached the region, the SS commander became obsessed with avoiding capture. Witnesses later claimed that he viewed the town's civilians not as people to protect, but as tools he could use. Orders spread through the area. Families were gathered. Movement became restricted. Confusion turned into panic as residents realized they were being forced into positions near military assets and retreat routes. The message was chilling. If American troops attacked, civilians would be caught in the middle. Parents immediately understood the danger. Every minute increased the risk that children and elderly residents could be killed in a battle they had nothing to do with. Some begged for mercy. Others searched for ways to escape. Few had any power to resist armed SS personnel. The consequences extended beyond the civilians themselves. If American commanders believed the area contained only military targets, a devastating tragedy could unfold. Innocent lives, military operations, and the town's future all hung in the balance. But the situation was about to become even more alarming when evidence suggested this was not a temporary act of panic. It appeared to be a deliberate strategy. And once word of that possibility began spreading beyond the town, people in positions of authority started paying attention. Then new witnesses came forward with claims that transformed the incident from a local tragedy into something far more serious. As American forces moved closer, more residents found opportunities to speak about what had been happening inside Leichenfels. The stories were remarkably consistent. Different witnesses, separated by age, background, and location, described the same growing pattern of fear. What first appeared to be a desperate attempt to slow an advance now seemed much darker. According to reports, the SS commander had become increasingly determined to preserve his own position regardless of the cost to civilians. Families were allegedly directed toward areas considered strategically important. Children were seen near locations that military planners would normally classify as potential targets. Residents began to suspect that their safety was no longer a priority at all. The psychological impact was devastating. Parents faced impossible choices. Some considered fleeing despite the risk of being arrested or shot. Others stayed because leaving elderly relatives behind felt unthinkable. Every rumor intensified the panic. Every approaching artillery sound reminded them that they were trapped between two armies. Meanwhile, American soldiers advancing through nearby regions were encountering evidence of similar acts committed by retreating Nazi units. The closer they moved toward Germany's interior, the more they discovered how desperation was influencing decision-making among certain commanders. As a result, reports involving civilians were taken seriously. Field officers began gathering information. Military intelligence personnel interviewed witnesses. Local accounts were compared. The same troubling question kept emerging. Was this officer simply trying to maintain order during a chaotic retreat, or had he intentionally placed innocent people in danger to protect himself? The distinction mattered enormously. If the allegations were true, the consequences reached far beyond one town. It would represent a profound abuse of authority during a period when civilian suffering was already reaching unimaginable levels. It would also raise difficult questions about how captured officers should be treated after the fighting ended. Then the reports traveled higher up the chain of command. What started as rumors from frightened civilians eventually reached senior American leadership. Among those receiving updates was General George S. Patton, a commander known for demanding discipline, accountability, and aggressive action from his forces. Patton had seen countless examples of courage and cowardice during the war. But allegations involving civilians, and especially children, were impossible to ignore. At first, he did not have all the facts. Conflicting accounts continued to arrive. Some reports described deliberate cruelty. Others suggested confusion created by the chaos of retreat. Determining the truth would require careful investigation. And while American commanders searched for answers, the SS officer was making plans of his own. Because he knew defeat was approaching. And he was already thinking about what might happen when he finally fell into American hands. When Patton received the latest intelligence summary, one detail immediately stood out, and it forced him to take a much closer look at the case. As investigators continued collecting testimony, the picture became increasingly complicated. The SS officer's defenders insisted that the accusations were exaggerated by fear and confusion. They argued that the final weeks of the war were chaotic, communication was breaking down everywhere, and decisions made under extreme pressure could easily be misunderstood afterward. But many witnesses rejected that explanation. The more statements investigators gathered, the more they noticed recurring details that were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Parents described similar movements of civilians. Elderly residents recalled being prevented from leaving certain areas. Former local officials spoke about orders that seemed designed to keep civilians exactly where military personnel wanted them. Each new account added weight to the allegations. For families in Leichenfels, the emotional scars remained long after the immediate danger passed. Children who had survived the ordeal struggled to understand why adults entrusted with authority had treated them as expendable. Mothers remembered nights spent wondering whether an artillery strike might kill their entire family before morning. Fathers carried the guilt of being unable to protect those they loved. The consequences extended beyond individual suffering. American officers worried about the broader message. Armies depend on discipline and responsibility. If commanders could deliberately endanger civilians and later avoid accountability, what precedent would that create? The issue was no longer just about one officer's conduct. It was becoming a test of whether authority carried consequences when abused. Then investigators uncovered something that intensified the controversy. Evidence suggested the officer had opportunities to reduce the danger but chose not to take them. Several witnesses claimed safer alternatives had existed during the retreat. If true, that meant the risks faced by civilians may not have been unavoidable products of war. They may have resulted from deliberate decisions. The distinction changed everything. A tragic mistake is one thing. A calculated choice is another. As these findings circulated through military channels, pressure increased on American leadership to determine exactly what had happened. Soldiers who had witnessed the aftermath wanted answers. Civilians wanted justice. Commanders wanted facts. Meanwhile, the officer himself remained in custody, watching events unfold. The confidence he once displayed was beginning to disappear. He understood that every new witness, every report, and every investigation narrowed his options. The man who once exercised power over an entire town was now dependent on the judgment of others. And soon, evidence would emerge that placed General Patton in an increasingly difficult position. What investigators discovered next threatened to turn a disturbing wartime allegation into a decision that could affect how justice itself would be carried out. By the time the investigation reached its most critical stage, General Patton faced a problem that extended far beyond one captured officer. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Thousands of prisoners were being processed. Allegations of misconduct, brutality, and war crimes were surfacing across liberated territories. Every case demanded attention, but resources were limited and emotions were running high. The officer from Leichenfels quickly became one of the most sensitive cases. Patton understood the danger of reaching a conclusion too quickly. Outrage alone could not determine guilt. Military justice required evidence. At the same time, ignoring credible testimony would undermine everything American forces claimed to be fighting for. As additional reports arrived, investigators began comparing witness statements line by line. They examined timelines, locations, and military movements. What made the case unusual was that many witnesses had never spoken to one another, yet their accounts shared striking similarities. That consistency strengthened the accusations. Still, conflicting information remained. A few individuals claimed the officer had merely followed orders from higher authorities. Others argued that retreating units were operating under extreme pressure and that decisions made during those final weeks could not be judged by peacetime standards. Supporters insisted he was being turned into a symbol for crimes committed by a much larger system. Patton could not ignore those arguments. Leadership often becomes most difficult when the answer seems obvious. Anyone can make a decision when every fact points in the same direction. The real burden comes when evidence is strong but not perfect, when emotions demand action but responsibility demands caution. As the investigation continued, Patton received detailed summaries from officers reviewing the case. Each report brought the same troubling conclusion. Regardless of broader circumstances, civilians appeared to have been placed in danger by decisions that were neither accidental nor unavoidable. The findings carried enormous weight. If accepted, they would establish that authority had been used not to protect innocent people but to shield those holding power. That principle struck at the heart of military leadership itself. Meanwhile, the former SS officer sensed where events were heading. The confidence that once defined him was gone. The man who had commanded armed men now spent his days waiting for decisions made by others. For the first time, he faced the possibility that rank, influence, and excuses might not save him. Then something unexpected happened. Rather than denying everything, the officer shifted his approach. He began asking for understanding. He began asking for compassion. And when word of that request reached Patton, the entire case entered its most controversial phase. The officer who showed little mercy when civilians feared for their lives was now pleading for mercy himself. But would Patton see a human being in need of compassion, or a leader facing the consequences of his own choices? The request for mercy quickly became the most debated aspect of the entire case. By this point, the former SS officer was no longer arguing about military strategy or battlefield necessity. Instead, he focused on his own circumstances. He described the confusion of the war's final days. He emphasized the pressure placed on commanders as Germany collapsed around them. He portrayed himself as a man caught inside a system that was already falling apart. For some observers, the appeal raised difficult questions. Should justice leave room for compassion? Can a person who made terrible decisions still deserve humane treatment? Or would mercy in this case send the message that power can be abused without meaningful consequences. Patton listened to the reports and reviewed the findings presented by investigators. The testimonies, the timelines, and the evidence all pointed toward the same conclusion. Innocent civilians had been placed at risk. Children had been exposed to danger they never chose. Authority had been used for self-preservation rather than protection. The central issue was no longer whether the officer deserved humane treatment. American military standards already required that. The real question was whether sympathy should lessen accountability. Patton ultimately separated those two ideas. A prisoner could be treated humanely. A prisoner could receive a fair review of the evidence. A prisoner could be protected from revenge and mob justice. But none of those protections erased responsibility. The decision sent a powerful message through the ranks. American soldiers were reminded that the difference between justice and vengeance mattered. They were not fighting to replace one abuse of power with another. They were fighting to establish that laws and accountability remained important even during war. For the civilians of Leichenfels, the outcome carried emotional significance. No decision could erase what families had endured. No ruling could remove memories of fear or uncertainty. But many believed the investigation had accomplished something essential. Their suffering had not been ignored. Their voices had been heard. And the authority that once seemed untouchable had finally been forced to answer for its actions. The former SS officer had spent weeks trying to protect himself by controlling the fate of others. In the end, he discovered that real power no longer belonged to him. It belonged to justice. Yet even after the decision, one question continued to divide soldiers, historians, and observers alike. Did Patton strike the right balance between mercy and accountability, or should the officer's fate have been even harsher? The case left a lasting lesson about leadership, power, and responsibility. The civilians of Leichenfels survived the war, but the fear they experienced served as a reminder of what can happen when authority is used to protect those in power instead of those who depend on it. Patton's decision reflected a principle that remains important today. Justice and humanity are not opposites. A leader can treat even an enemy fairly while still holding them accountable for their actions. Supporters argue that Patton was right because he separated emotion from responsibility and refused to let sympathy erase the consequences of harmful decisions. Critics believe stronger punishment would have sent a clearer message. But the larger lesson is timeless. Real leadership is measured not by how much power someone has, but by how they use it. When authority is abused, accountability must follow. And when justice is guided by principle rather than revenge, it becomes far more powerful than fear.